Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So, as you know, Tuesday means Type 2 or Standard Tuesday, and we have a pretty spicy one today. So this is Grixis Improvise, and this is a deck that Hall of Famer Willie Adel and some other people played at Pro Tour Aether Revolt this weekend, and while the deck's performance, not super exciting, it did get the award for limited deck that performed best in Constructed. Basically, if you're looking for a use for your draft leftovers from the Kaladesh block, this deck might be the place you can put them to use, and even better, the deck is almost budget. It's a little bit over $100 in paper. Anyway, a quick reminder before we break down the deck. If you enjoy this deck and you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So Grixis Improvise is built around turning really bad janky artifacts into Llanowar elves or elvish mystics. So I think Willie Adel actually made this comparison in his interview at the Pro Tour. Implementive Combustion is essentially a Llanowar elves in this deck, and if you think about it, the deck is built around the Improvise mechanic. Expensive cards with Improvise, but Improvise lets you tap artifacts to help pay a card's mana cost. So if you can play a bunch of cheap artifacts in the early game, you essentially turn them all into Llanowar elves because you can tap them to play your big finishers. So that's kind of the entire theory of this deck. Implementive Combustion also has the upside of shutting down the Saheeli Rai Felidar Guardian combo when your opponent goes to blink the Saheeli Rai with Felidar Guardian. The Saheeli Rai will only have one counter on it, and you can ping it for the 1 damage, ping your opponent actually, and then redirect to Saheeli Rai, break up the combo. Renegade Map helps fixes your mana, plus of course it's a Llanowar Elves that enters the battlefield tapped because you can tap it for Improvise. The key pieces of the deck though are the 2-drop artifacts. So Cogworkers, Puzzle Knot, and Servo Schematic, pretty close to the same exact card in this deck. They're artifacts that make another artifact, so for 2 mana you get 2 artifacts, which both produce mana when you go to cast your Improvise card. So what this deck really wants to do is curve out a 1 mana artifact, like the Implement or Renegade Map, into a Cogworkers, Puzzle Knot, or Servo Schematic, which is going to give the deck 3 artifacts on the battlefield going into turn 3. Also, Key to the City is kind of a backup. It's more for the long game, but you can use it with Improvise. You can tap it to Improvise, and then when it untaps, you get to draw a card for free. So it's a way you can kind of break the symmetry of the Discardian card. You just skip over the discard part. Also, another artifact you can tap, but the nut draw in this deck is turn 1 artifact, turn 2 Cogworkers, Puzzle Knot, or Servo Schematic, and then on turn 3, you get to start playing some really powerful threats on the cheap. So these cards, Maverick Thopterist, Bastion Inventor, are not absurd if you read their mana cost. 5 mana, 6 mana, but when you consider in this deck their 3 drops, they're really powerful. Maverick Thopterist, if you consider 3 mana, you get a 2/2 and 2/1/1 flyers. That's a super powerful card. It's like the Lingering Souls of Standard. Bastion Inventor, you get a 4/4 hexproof for only 3 mana. Super, super good. It's like Fleece Mainline or something. So you're doing all this for only 3 mana, and then ideally, on turn 4, after you've played your Thopterist, after you've played your Bastion Inventor, you untap and you Herald of Anguish, the big finisher for the deck. So normally 7 mana for a 5/5 flyer. If you can tap 4 artifacts, which is very possible in this deck, you play it for 3 or 4 mana. And then you have this huge flying threat. You can sack your Servo Schematics to kill your opponent's stuff. It pressures your opponent's hand immediately, so it almost has an enter the battlefield ability because it triggers on your first end step, so your opponent doesn't get a chance to use sorcery speed removal on it, and then you start pressuring your opponent's hand, whittling away their cards, and just beating down in the air. The other 3 drops in the deck are even more exciting. Tezzeret's Touch takes advantage of the fact you have all these random artifacts, so Servo Schematic, after you've tapped it for mana to cast your big stuff, doesn't really do much. It just kind of sits around. But Tezzeret's Touch can turn that into a huge 5/5 beater to just take over the game, beat your opponent down. You can put it on an Implement or Renegade Map, even one of your Servo tokens, and then PNLR gives you a flying blocker and some additional value with your artifacts. You can sack an artifact to make one of your big threats, like your Hexproof Bastion Inventor unblockable, pump up your artifact creatures, so it just does a lot in the deck. The last piece of the main deck is kind of some ways to disrupt the opponent. Metallic Rebuke lets you tap your artifacts to counter something, often being a 1 mana leak, which is a really absurd card, especially in Standard. And Unlicensed Disintegration is just a great removal spell. It's sort of a Searing Blaze, except it kills the creature every single time, and since this deck has so many artifacts, you're always getting that 3 damage for only 3 mana. In the mana base, Aether Hub and Spire of Industry make sure the mana is super consistent. You get a total of 6 5-color lands, Smoldering Marsh, Spirebluff Canal, Sunken Hollow as additional duels, and then some basics. As far as the sideboard, Fatal Push gives you more removal for the early game. We saw Heart of Kiran be a huge card at the Pro Tour. Winding Constrictor, probably the second most important card at the Pro Tour. Fatal Push kills both of those, even without Revolt for just 1 mana. The fourth, Unlicensed Disintegration, a Quicksmith Rebel to do some tricky shooting down of things. People have kind of compared it to a janky Flametongue Kavu, but it's sort of similar. Release the Gremlins lets you destroy a whole bunch of artifacts to get some creatures out of it. And then in more controlling matchups, you have Liliana to pressure your opponent with a Planeswalker, a Negate to disrupt your opponent, and Aethersphere Harvester happens to block Heart of Kiran really well, can gain you some life, and that is Grixis Improvise for Aether Revolt Standard. And that's our instant deck tech for today, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.